A little bit of a background, because many of you won't know who I am. My name is John Timney. I'm a SharePoint MVP. I've been an MVP for 15 years, which is a little bit unusual in the community because it makes me a bit of an antique. Had about 25 years in the business. I am really that old. In those 25 years, I've pretty much only worked for large organizations, so big consulting firms. So I tend to have a big consulting perspective on projects and programs. Unfortunately, it gives me the opportunity to do things like this and experience projects when they're having a crisis, so to speak. I specialize in assurance, enterprise architecture, strategy, mostly on virtualized platforms, and have done for quite some time now. And I've done a few books in the past, co-authored a few books on Java, .NET, on SharePoint. You can find most of them in good charity bookshops these days. I'm the administrator for the SharePoint user group in the north of England. So if any of you really want to start talking about technology and happen to be in the northeast, by all means, drop me a line. We'll get you on stage. It's not as scary as it might seem at first. Just to add to my credentials, I've just finished a really interesting piece of assurance for a failing 170,000 seat SharePoint 2013 project, which involved 22 SharePoint farms and a hybrid Office 365 build. So I've got a lot of experience, and hopefully we can pass some of that on to you. I'm from up north. I do speak quite quickly. If I'm talking too fast, by all means, put your hand up and tell me to slow down. I won't be offended. Don't throw anything unless it's pound coins, because I don't get paid for doing this. So, right, we have got an agenda. I am organised enough. We're quite literally going to just look through the various phases of SharePoint and identify what commonly goes wrong in these things and what seems to repeat itself. We'll look at communications, the initiation phase. We'll look at planning, building out SharePoint. We'll touch on release management and testing, the two most boring subjects on the planet. And we'll touch on governance and support to finish off. And please, by all means, ask questions. The deck normally takes about 55 minutes. It's packed with information. We're not going to cover everything on the slide deck. But by all means, ask questions. And if we've got time for it, we'll try to answer them. Sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat this morning. OK, we'll start with comms. Communication is really important. And what we want to see in every project is really excellent communications between all the members of the project team. So what we want is good communication. It's really important for you to actually understand this. What we see on projects is, I'm the boss, and only my opinion counts. And we see this over and over again. This is a rather tongue-in-cheek view of project managers and what they think of themselves. Say they're all Wonder Woman, they're all Superman, stars in their own skies. They give us the right to work on their SharePoint projects. This is what the delivery team think of project managers. And again, you can take this any way you like. They're good at fixing things. They like shiny objects. They're kind to animals. Of course, we don't get away unscathed ourselves, because actually, frankly, people think we're a bunch of techie geeks, don't they? We're all a bunch of workers, code monkeys. We dance in a really odd fashion at discos, purely occupied mainly by men. Unfortunately, because we're underrepresented by females in the industry, aren't we? So we have a bit of a tainted view, don't we? And that view actually creates a lot of confusion when we're trying to communicate, because we don't have much in common with the people we tend to have to work with. Delivery don't have much in common with our clients. We don't have a lot in common with project managers often. Project managers don't have a great in common with cloud hosters or service suppliers. If you're a developer, you've loads of information available for you on MSDN. If you're an IT pro, there's tons of material on TechNet to help you do your job. Information workers can hang around in office.com and learn lots about what they need to do in relation to SharePoint. But the rest of us, the rest of delivery people, project managers, clients, customers, don't really have any help. That causes a lot of confusion in communication. And when things do go wrong, we tend to get a lot of finger pointing. We do actually work in a very blame-oriented culture. And often delivery will blame the management when things go wrong. Management usually blame delivery, or we blame the customer. Worst thing we can do. And we hear lots of common communications phrases coming out. The design was wrong. Really common one that we hear all the time on projects. Somebody forgot to order that. Everybody tries to pass the blame onto somebody else. They hadn't done their homework, implying that the IT pros, perhaps, or the developers didn't really understand what they were trying to do, or hadn't communicated enough with the client to appreciate the level of depth of work they needed to do. Contractors, agencies. The amount of times I hear criticism of bad staff being supplied by agencies and contract companies into organisations and projects failing, they always blame the contractors. His CV had all the right buzzwords, implying that while we had the staff in front of us, we didn't do the interviews the right way. They should have anticipated that. Bit of a slur on the IT pros again for not working closely enough with the end users or the business sponsors to actually identify what was required. Build it and they will come. A phrase we still hear in SharePoint projects these days. Build it and they will come. We drive these programs from an IT perspective rather than from the business. And lots of phrases like that that you've probably heard many times yourselves. Good comms comes from good management on a project. You need to have strong project management on SharePoint projects if the product is that big these days. You need strong enterprise assurance. You need strong architecture on a project. Those people are the ones you need to fill the gaps between all of the different parts of a project delivery team. Clients, delivery people like developers, the customers, the end users, business sponsors, support teams. Somebody has to fill the void. On many failing projects, we don't see anybody filling this gap. And there's a bunch of repeated, consistent failure points on every project that we see fail. If things are going wrong, the project manager needs to know. Quite often, IT pros particularly are bad at telling the project manager that they're having issues. We need people to be very honest about this. Don't be afraid of saying, I don't know. We had a conversation like this last night, actually, at the SharePoint afterwards. People are very scared of saying, I don't know how to do something. It's often seen as a weakness. As an enterprise architect, I need people to tell me they don't know how to do something so I can react to that and plan for it. And if the teams are hiding behind, I know how to do something, I'll learn it on the job, that's going to be a problem for your project. If it's got to be done, write it down. Don't assume everybody knows what they're doing. Make sure it's written down and given to them. If you're the delivery guy, ask for it to be written down. Or how can you prove that you've done what you're asked to do? How can you ask for your pay rise at the end of the year? SLAs, OLAs, in the cloud world we're moving to, horrendously complicated things. You'd be amazed how many clients are starting to take advantage of things like Office 365 without ever reading the service level agreements that go with it. And subsequently, they don't understand how complicated it is or what kind of service they're going to get back from the customer. You need to communicate with the sales agents at Microsoft and work out what the SLA is actually about. Have a RACI. Sounds obvious. Everybody on the project team needs to understand who's got responsibility for what part of the project, and you must make sure that's communicated out to the project team and they understand what their responsibility is. Meetings are a really horrible, bad thing. I've been on many projects where there's been an organised meeting every night sometimes, every morning, regular meeting on a Tuesday where we have a meeting, a regular catch-up. For what purpose? It's absolutely pointless. All it does is consume time. If you're going to have meetings on your project team, make them count. Have an agenda for the meeting and make sure everybody understands why you're there. Communicate out why you're going to have this meeting. Don't just have meetings regularly scheduled for meeting's sake. All it does is take time. Don't scrimp on being social. The most successful projects I've come across actually have nights out for their project teams. Now, this sounds a really simplistic thing. You'd be amazed how many of the delivery team tell me how many issues they're having when they've had a drink or two. And don't tell me anything when they're in the office environment. It's remarkable what a pizza can do to somebody, especially when it's accompanied with a glass of wine. Watch for stress. Now, this one sounds really obvious again, and it's another one that people miss. I've just come off a big, major international program of work where two teams sat in the same room, hadn't communicated for nearly 6 months. And they were sat alongside each other. The only thing separating the team was the walkway down the centre of the room. One team was working like idiots, and the other team was working like idiots trying to catch up with the work this other team were doing. And never did they take any time out just to communicate between themselves about the problems each of the teams were having. Both of them were understaffed, as it happens. If you're a manager, be approachable. Again, this sounds really obvious. You'd be surprised how many projects have got managers on them who are, quite literally, I am the boss. What I say counts. What I say is the only way forward. You need to have what's called an open door policy, and you've got to understand that people have opinions and views. You have to accept those opinions and work out whether or not they count. It's no good just being the one who makes the decisions if you're the manager. So, message, don't underestimate how important communications is to the success of SharePoint projects. When we had SharePoint 2003, didn't really matter. You put the disk in, you kind of did it, and there wasn't a lot to it. 2007 made it more complicated. 2010 took the product into the whole holistic architecture. With 2013, when we bring in the hybrid builds, third-party suppliers, Rackspace, Microsoft, that kind of thing, it's immensely complicated. Communication between all parties becomes much more important. So that's the first lesson. We've got to get our communication right. Every project I see failing has poor communication in it. The next thing we need to do is make sure we get our vision right. Now, this is really confusing for people for some reason. What we want to see at the outset of a project are a clear set of achievable business requirements, and we need business support for that as well. What we tend to see is, actually, we don't really need a vision statement because everybody knows what we're doing. And this is the first mistake that we see happen on projects. Every failed project I step into, I can come all the way back to this vision problem of a project having not identified really what it was they were trying to do. Consequently, the scope wasn't really known by people. We'll just explain how difficult it is to understand what vision's about. Vision's really about describing a desired outcome. And this is a statement I've pulled off the internet. Enable people and businesses throughout the world to realize their full potential. Just a little test from the audience here. Who thinks that's Microsoft's mission statement? Put your hands up. Who thinks it's Microsoft's vision statement? So everyone's a little bit confused here because we can't really get an answer here. Who thinks I've completely made this up? Now that's the answer I normally get. It's actually Microsoft's mission statement. Vision statement is something a bit different. It's a bit seductive, something sexy, to be honest. It's kind of what you want to be. It's what you want to achieve. Where the mission statement is really why the organization exists in the first place. SharePoint, specifically SharePoint 2013, requires vision. So you might be trying to do something like improve collaboration in the organization. You're not trying to change the way that you build cars, but you're trying to improve the communication channels between people. You might want to do better publishing. You might want to do more efficient storage by taking advantage of things like SQL 2012 and shredded storage technologies that have been brought in. And everything you do from this point forward should tie back to this original vision stage. Sometimes we call it project startup, sometimes we call it project kickoff, but really it's about putting the vision on the table and making sure everybody actually understands it. In this phase, you should be doing all of these different things here. I'm not going to talk about all of these, there's far too many on these slides. But you should be evaluating the feature set in SharePoint 2013 to understand that it's going to deliver the actual things that you want. You should be looking at things like Office 365 and Azure and working out whether or not you can take advantage of those services. Does it actually fit with your organizational culture at all? You should be looking at what the customer needs are for SharePoint and whether or not it's the right product for your internal teams. Looking at what the major milestones are and working out whether or not you can actually achieve them within budget. Who's got a project initiation document on their project? So that's kind of what we see, about 30%. Now, one of the problems with not having a project initiation document is it means that you can't formulate an opinion on what it is that the project's actually trying to do. As an enterprise architect, I rely on people formulating opinions and coming and questioning me about what the vision is for what the project's looking to do. And one of the first places I try and look on a failed project, I come back and ask for the vision document, for the PID, project initiation document, so I can understand the scope of what the project was looking to do. And often I don't get that. Often projects haven't got it. You should also define at this stage what the success criteria is for the project. Again, we don't see this happening very often. If it's about delivering on time, your job really is to question what the definition of done is for that. What do you mean by delivering on time? Be specific. If it's about things like providing required functionality, your job is to negotiate and compromise on what that might be. It might be impossible to do that in SharePoint. If you move into some sort of cloud-hosted model, you should question, what's the cost of this? If we go to Azure, it has a sliding scale of costs. Pretty hard to understand. Does the SLA for something like Office 365 even fit with your culture? Can your people even work like that? Does your security standards, for example, fit that? Often people make these kind of success statements without evaluating what the consequences are. And of course, the wrong constraints can equally impact success. At this stage, you need to understand what the financial constraints are going to be on your project teams to make sure you're not just going to hit a brick wall when you run out of finance because you've over-engineered your solutions. This is another interesting point as well, one we see confusing people all the time. It's not the project manager's job to actually define success. A lot of people rely on the PM to tell people what the success criteria is. It's not the project manager's job, it's the business sponsor's job to define that success criteria. Project manager's job is just to achieve the milestones that need to be met. So it's really important that we understand what the success criteria and the constraints actually are. And again, in this startup phase, this visionary phase, whatever we want to call it, we see some really simple and repetitive failure points coming about in every single project that I see that fails. Because you work in dev, you're kind of left out. We don't ask your opinion at the start of a project. Why are you important? You're just a developer. You're only important when we get to Scrum much later on or start building components and gadgets. When actually, I need your skills to help me refine what that project plan might look like, to understand how complicated a piece of work might be as early as this envisioning phase. You work in support. Management always are the ones who outline the vision. And what ends up happening is you've got a much closer relationship to the end users who are going to be impacted by putting something like SharePoint into the organization or changing how it functions. Whole raft of other things that go wrong. Inexperienced managers getting confused between mission with vision. We've just seen how easy it is for that to actually happen. SharePoint being trendy, so they pick this even though it doesn't fit in with their technology stack in any way whatsoever. And they haven't got the support skills to support it once it's in because they're traditionally an Oracle or a Java house and haven't made the right assessments. Poor grasp of the cost benefits. No understanding of how expensive SharePoint can be, and it's anything but a cheap product. And this is a new one that we're starting to see in lots of projects now, treating vendors as partners. Vendors are not partners, they're suppliers. When you go to Curry's or some shop on the high street, they don't treat you as a partner, so you shouldn't do that with a supplier. They have their own agenda. It's not usually the same as yours. Their agenda is to sell you something. Your agenda is to constrain that. And of course, we've already started spending money when we get to this stage. We're already investing in the project team. And typically, we don't give this phase enough credibility. We don't give it enough credence to actually ensure that we completely understand what the vision is. And most importantly, we've communicated this out to everybody who works in the project team. So, we now know we've got really poor communication and a bunch of recurring errors. And we now know we need to outline what the vision looks like. And commonly, those kind of problems exist in every project that we've seen so far. And the planning phase itself is really important. And we see a whole raft of repeatable problems coming up over and over again. And what we want to see in planning is this: comprehensive plans with realistic and validated milestones. Now, often that validation can involve building pilot systems, test systems, to actually make sure that the timelines on the plan and the critical path are well understood by the project team. What we tend to see is SharePoint cannot be that complex. We can skip most of this stuff. Some real-world observations for planning. Most SharePoint plans are going to have between 500 and 1,500 lines of code in them. 1,500 activities which a project team might have to deliver. Most of the project plans that I have about 10,000 lines in them. The majority of project plans I come across from even moderately successful projects have about 1,500 in. You should have every single activity in SharePoint that you could possibly do in your project plan. Doesn't have to have any time allocated against it. Doesn't have to have any staff allocated against it. But the difficulty you have is when somebody comes and says, you know, what happens if we want to put records management in? You can't tell them because you haven't got the action in your project plan. You don't know what the critical path's going to change to. It means you're working on guesswork all the time. The best project plans have virtually every facet of SharePoint in them, even if you're not going to deliver it. Implementations typically take between 5 and 18 months for highly successful projects. Failed projects, obviously, trying to recover take much, much longer. It's different if you're trying to take advantage of something like Office 365 and commodity services. You can probably get that up and running within a matter of days, to be honest, in its most basic form. On-prem instances take an awful long time, and people hugely underestimate how long SharePoint takes to get in. SharePoint requires massive specialist skills these days, and it's entirely misunderstood by the business. There's no such thing anymore as a SharePoint administrator/architect. That went out with the 2010 world, and some people, for some reason, still cling to this job title of SharePoint architect as well. And technically, that job doesn't really exist either, unless you're an MCM. It's hugely underestimated in the detail that's required for people. As simple as administration itself, but you cannot be an expert in all of SharePoint any longer. Most IT pros will not get the complexity. Projects that are driven by IT pros tend to be very focused on things like infrastructure. The first question I tend to get from many people, from IT pros, is how many boxes will we need to do that? How much is the licensing going to cost? What we want to hear is, what's the business requirements? Ask a developer to plan. You get a plan that involves lots of widgets and gadgets and code creation. The last place they tend to go and look is third-party market for tools and technology, which is the first place you should look. We have to recognize that SharePoint is no longer just click and run. It's a massive set of sub-projects managed and maintained by a really comprehensive plan. The most important and successful projects I've seen work have lots of different members of staff responsible for different aspects of the service. Typically, managers responsible for doing certain aspects, implementers for building, doing components, and information managers who are responsible for getting the taxonomy and structure right. And rarely can any one person do all of these activities these days. There's a whole raft of actions to keep people who call themselves managers busy. They should be doing things like pulling the project teams together, looking at things like the coexistence strategies, looking at the design objectives and mapping those back to the vision, creating governance plans. As early as the planning phase, you should start on governance, planning for that. Performing risk assessments. I wonder how many in the audience have ever performed a risk assessment on taking SharePoint into the business and whether or not it's a good idea, even though you've got the budget allocated for this, and what the impact on your user base might be. Critically these days, planning and preparing for upgrades as we move from 2007 or 2010 to 2013 takes an awful lot longer than you ever think it might do. What about planning for cloud-based services? How many in the room think they're capable of planning for cloud-based services? Do you really think you've got a lot of relearning to do in this new world that we're starting to move to? Microsoft are ahead of the curve. If you work in the management side of SharePoint implementations, there's a whole raft of information on TechNet already for you. You don't need to write these down because you get the slide decks at the end. And that can help you tremendously understanding the scope of being involved in the management side of a SharePoint delivery. If you're an implementer, you're into build, again, you should be looking at things like getting the test labs set up to ensure that that plan can be validated. Don't just have dev and prod. It's no good these days. You should be working out how you're going to integrate design manager use and how you need to upskill yourselves for this kind of thing, for building in new technology. Establishing software libraries. You'd be surprised how many people don't have a software library and end up trying to download software from the internet and finding that the version's changed to the one that they thought they were building with, or something that they've attached onto SharePoint. Upgrades. That was on the last slide. So somehow the implementation people also need to be talking to the management people about the impact of a SharePoint upgrade. You should be looking at things like network considerations. Remarkably, the majority of failing projects that I come across have not considered the network impact of putting something like SharePoint into the organization, and they think it's not going to have any change. And yet they open it up to the external world, allow tens of thousands of new external clients in, and forget that their internet pipe is about this big when it needs to be this big. This is a really common thing. We see this over and over. Who's going to do your planning for failover and DR? I've just come off a project where they actually forgot to test DR, and they thought they could go live without it. Of course, when they tested it, it didn't work. They've had to push their project plan massively to the right, and it's costing them thousands to recover this. You should be planning for things like bring your own device now. Even though you might not even have SharePoint on the ground yet, and you're only in the planning phase, looking ahead into the market about what's going to change. Somebody's going to ask you in the next few months, what are we doing about BYOD? And you might not have the answer. That could critically impact the architecture of your SharePoint platform, that simple question. In a world where we're all moving to having 3, 4, 5 different devices, multiple technologies, multiple architecture stacks, that somehow the companies have to support that we're putting SharePoint into. And it's a destination for failure at the minute. Critically, you should be planning for deprecated features. What are you going to do with those things? People are going to rely on you to actually answer those questions. And again, Microsoft have come up trumps on this one. There's a whole raft of stuff to help you out there. If you're an information manager, you specialize in things like taxonomy, term stores, site structure and site management, there's a whole raft of things that you need to be doing in this early planning phase as well. Content navigation structures, site navigation, looking at managed metadata and how that's going to be impacted across the whole of the farm. What are you going to do about other sources of technology in the organization as well that should be using metadata? You kind of think of SharePoint in isolation these days. For SharePoint 2013 particularly, what are you going to do about the community features that have evolved, that are coming out? What if your organization has people who are predominantly over the age of 40 and don't really like Yammer and Facebook and can't really cope with this stuff? You know, you've got a significant amount of change ahead that you haven't considered as part of a SharePoint implementation. Again, deprecated features and upgrades. Coming back again to communications across the program team, you've got to be talking about these things with everybody in the project. You should not make these decisions in isolation, and yet we see it over and over again on failing projects where I'm the boss, my opinion counts, therefore I'll make the decisions. So, a whole set of reusable and common failure points across projects that we see. Like the last phase, staff get sidelined. I don't want to talk to Dev until we get to Scrum. And yet, frankly, I'm trying to plan something, and I give an estimate of 3 days for a component being built, and it takes 10 days. I've lost 7 days of time. If that happens for 10 components, I've lost 70 days of time. My project plan has now gone skew-if. 70 days of time, if you're recruiting some sort of external consultancy agency, it's going to cost you about £60,000 of unplanned budget. That's for one poor estimation across a couple of components. What if I get the build times completely wrong and it takes me another 3 or 4 weeks? There's another 40 or 50k gone in on consultancy time. And suddenly your project plan is going out of the window because your costs are going through the roof. Managers don't share the final plan, and I've been guilty of this myself before I learned it was a really bad thing to do. Plans are really hard to write, and people grasp onto it as if it's a little baby. I'm going to keep this plan, I'm not going to give it out. What they give out is little snippets of information to the dev teams, and I want you to do this action. What they don't do is put it on the wall so everybody can see it in huge print, so we can see where it's going wrong and everybody can be accountable for what's happening on the project team as a collective rather than an individual thing. The plan is done. Long live the plan. You would be amazed how many projects I turn up to who are having issues, and I say, where's your plan? They either say, we haven't got one, or it's 18 months out of date. And they're wondering why they can't actually achieve the milestones that they're supposed to hit, because they don't understand the original project scope, because they didn't have a vision, and the plan's out of date now, so they've got no chance of understanding what it is exactly that they're trying to deliver. This is a very common problem that we see. The plan has to evolve. There's a lot of mushroom management goes on in failing projects, and I've seen this over and over. We see a lot of team meetings where just managers are involved in it, and what you get as delivery people is a filter of what they kind of discussed. It's much better when you start to see issues on a project to get everybody involved in these conversations. Don't leave anybody out, doesn't matter how many you think they are. They might come up with that one nugget of information that actually rescues something on a project that all of the management team might not spot, all of the architects, all of the engineers might not see. And Bill, who's fresh out of university, might just come up with that one snippet that rescues your project. Be surprised how often this happens. There's poor or little definition of success criteria. So you don't know when you're done. You don't know when you're actually finished. How are you going to get client sign-off for something? And then next thing you see, you're dragged into court because the client said you haven't delivered something and you're faced with a litigation case. Much worse if you're an individual contractor and you haven't really understood what it is you're trying to deliver, but bad if you're representing clients as well and doing this kind of work. Again, very strong on the cloud and the push towards hybrid these days. External dependencies are not understood. We know what we're trying to do on the project team, but we didn't really know what this provider was trying to do, who we're going to buy services from. We didn't know what their agenda was, and we didn't understand what their plans looked like. And their plans might have nothing in common with our plans. We've got to make sure we actually tie those things together. And quite often, we see SharePoint teams working in isolation without talking to people like the network teams. So, for this, it's much better to come back and refine it and push your plan to the right with approval of the client or the business sponsor than it is to fail the project and then have to come back and rescue it. Rescue is a bad word. Failure is a really bad word. Agreeing with the client that you need to push to the right for specific reasons to solve specific problems that you've identified is a much better approach, and it helps with that communications issue. Also, one of the things we see in this planning phase, we see a lot of people slagging off people. We do what we call therapy sessions with people where we say, tell us what your problems are. That bloody supplier, that blooming customer. And then next thing we find is somebody's been on Twitter or Facebook and posted this. And it comes back around. And it happened recently with a young girl appointed as a police commissioner in the UK, a police commissioner sponsor, that she'd put something out on the internet and it got back to her employers and she's lost her job. This stuff happens in SharePoint projects as well. It's a very close circle. if you slag off your project, or you talk about people or suppliers or partners or relationships, those things can break down. They can massively impact your ability to deliver a project if your relationship breaks down and a supplier pulls out of working with you at a critical point on the plan. So be proactive, be positive about stuff, and make sure that not only is the project team informed about what the critical deadlines are, but actually your suppliers are as well, and make sure you understand what their deadlines are. So, we understand now that we need to have clearer communications, and many projects fail because of that. We understand that we need to have a very well-defined vision, and many projects fail because we don't have that. We also understand we need to have really comprehensive plans, and plans are difficult. They're not easy to do. It's a very specialized area, and SharePoint's huge these days. So assuming we've got those things in place, we then start building stuff. We want to start releasing components and gadgets. And what we want to see off the back of that plan is clear deliverables without any confusion that map back to the business vision. What we see is this. Put the disk in, it's bound to work. Again, a really common problem. Deploying SharePoint is horribly complex. If you've ever had to try and build SharePoint and you're not just like an information manager who works with it once it's in and stuff, it's massively complicated. SharePoint 2013 is quite a hard install, to be honest. You've got to get the environments up and running, put the hardware in, get the software working, build the solutions. Get your interop working, any integrations with things. But this one particularly, document as you go. You would be amazed how many projects they turn up to and the guys have just got on and done this, and there's absolutely no documentation to refer back to. And then somebody dies, leaves, gets hit by a bus, takes long-term illness because of stress. Nobody's got any idea what they're doing on the project team, and they've got no documentation to refer to. And they're calling people like me, and the first thing I come into the sentence is, where's your documentation? Is that me or is that you? Can you still hear me? You're not supposed to ask, can you hear me at the back, but I'll ask you, can you hear me at the back? Okay, so deployment is much more complex than just these activities we've got here. If we just take the software for SharePoint alone, and what we have to do, we've got to do all of these kind of things. Horrendously complicated SharePoint is. And this one gets missed a lot. Failover disaster recovery software. What gets missed is the testing of it. People put DPM in but forget to test it in a full failover scenario. Somebody just tells them it works. Hypervisor monitoring, another one gets missed. We're all moving to a virtual world. We install SCOM in the management packs. We forget to test and monitor the hypervisors underneath. Then it performs like a dog. And everybody wonders why, because we've got too many hypervisors on a blade server, too many virtual machines running on infrastructure. And we haven't got any monitoring to tell us that that's a problem that's actually happening. And of course, we often see SharePoint systems running without the latest service packs and security updates on them. And this is a really common problem as well when we're trying to build things, that people don't actually understand they should work with the latest service packs. But those service packs actually also need to be kept in your software library. And what we often see is people going out the internet to try and search for one. They waste a lot of time putting the wrong service packs on, or trying to put the wrong service packs on, and then corrupting their build. And it's a really common issue. At this stage, your low-level design should be 99% complete. The minute you begin building anything other than a test environment to validate what your plan looks like, your design should be set in stone. And the amount of projects I come across where the design's kind of half done and they're going to validate as they work through and build things, and all you're asking for is trouble down the line. The only thing you should be changing when you're starting to put infrastructure in is service account names, IP addresses, machine names. Everything else should be absolutely fixed, because if it isn't fixed, your plan's not right. Your team should know exactly what they're doing by this point. And of course, there's lots of environments that we have to build, and we see many projects missing these out. You need pilot systems, if you need pilot systems. Dev, test, staging. Many projects simply have dev and prod these days, and we still see this, and it's a massive issue. You should have a mechanism for doing reporting and escalations back up to the managers on your project and to the client about the state of the project and how it's working. And if you haven't got this kind of escalation mechanism in your project, it's a problem that you've got to flag. You need to go back to your project and say, you know, we need some mechanism for telling people how well we're doing, for communicating out to the business what our status is. RAG status, red, amber and green status, a common project management methodology, just for highlighting how well aspects of a project might be doing. And you should be testing like lunatics at this point. It's remarkable how many projects are live with minimal amount of testing. What they really mean is, actually, we managed to get it configured, therefore it's okay. We can go with that. And release management becomes all important at this stage. Just ask RBS about the problems that have occurred because they didn't do effective release management control. And that's just one very big public example. Most of the projects I see that don't work well have no release management whatsoever involved in them, and we'll talk about that a bit later. So, all of the failure points that we see repeating themselves on SharePoint projects that go wrong and the build phase are all about timing. If you get to the point where you're starting to build stuff, it's far too late to be ordering infrastructure. Infrastructure is hard to get racked. It's difficult to put in. Sometimes it's difficult to find the right budgets to pay for this and find out who's even going to, which budgetary track in the company it's going to come from. Storage, even worse. It takes months to get SAN racked properly and configured, aggregates set up, LUNs identified and mapped, speed tests done, redundancy paths set up. Too late to determine if the networks can cope. You're already going to start bombarding the network with traffic by turning on the features of SharePoint when you're testing it. So at startup, it needs to be in a test network if you're building test environments, but actually once it's on the live production network, if you're bombarding that network with traffic, you could affect the operation of the whole business. It's far too late to be planning for staff now. The reason you have a plan is to identify what staff are necessary, and yet we still see people going out and seeking staff from the market just as they start build. Too late to be planning downtime. Companies live and die by downtime. Unplanned downtime can actually affect a business in ways that you might never think of, especially if it happens at financial year end. All you need to do is swamp the network, cripple the domain controllers with some unplanned release that you've put onto the network, and suddenly the organization's out of business. It's too late to order the test tooling for the dev team. They should have told you months ago what the test tooling was that they actually needed. And they should be skilled up enough to be able to use this, and for you to have confidence that the testing they're doing is actually appropriate. If you're building, it's far too late to be training staff. And it's too late to allow your staff to actually wing it, and we see this over and over on field projects. Really common one we come across these days, because there is such a shortage of skills in the UK and in Europe especially, trying to bring offshore workers onshore to fill the shortages of things like developer resources or build resources. It takes about 6 months to get onshore workers brought in from places like India. It is far too late to realise you're short on specialist skills. More SharePoint people, if you've ever tried to recruit SharePoint people, they're really hard to find. It's far too late at this point to realise you've got a dependency on specialist skills. You're already building. Your timelines are ticking away. You're running out of budget. Really common one, reacting to last minute holiday requests. The amount of projects I've come across where Mavis has gone to the travel agents on Saturday and booked herself a cheap deal with the travel agent to head off to South Africa next week when we have a critical build on, and the manager is not strong enough to say, I'm sorry, that was completely inappropriate and I can't support that. Again, stepping back to the fact that we need strong management. We also need sensible staff on the projects who realise that you can't be doing things like putting in last minute holiday requests. Accreditation is another big one that we see. Most projects fail on this. A lot of my government clients fail on formal security accreditation, which takes at least 6 months to accomplish. And yet they start this 2 weeks before go live. And they wonder then why they can't get sign off for the system and get it up and live. These are what we call unmanaged impacts in the build phase. Every unmanaged impact incurs a cost. Every additional cost over budget could incur failure of your project, because you might not be able to take your project forward if there's that much unmanaged cost surfacing on the project team. So, comms, really important. You can see it surfacing itself through each of these phases already. Okay? Having the vision, making sure everything ties back to that vision, really important that we continue down that chain. Very important that we get our plans really strong, and some of the build reasons will help you understand why our planning's absolutely critically important these days. And there's a lot of things that go wrong in build that we need to constrain and control, mostly about issues for timing. And then we have this horribly boring thing called release management. Now this is nearly as boring as testing, but it's just as essential. And what we want to see as we start putting things into the environments that we're preparing to create is documented control and rollback capabilities. What we tend to say is, get on with it, I've got to pick the kids up. Again, a really common problem. Release management's not independent of build, but it can be, and it's usually best if it is. It's got to be driven by quality. You need to understand what you're doing. You need to capture the information about what a release looks like. What does a release pack look like in your organization? How does anybody know whether something has authority to be released into the environment unless it's written down, unless it's documented and somebody signs it off to say it's good to go? It's a very skilled job. I have real issues finding people who understand the ethos of release management in relation to SharePoint. What kind of packages are we allowed to release? How should we do this? What does the rollback strategy look like? It should never be done by the project manager. On most projects we see fail, release management is an activity that's authorised and approved by the PM. PM has a vested interest in hitting the milestones. If you can afford it on your project, make sure you have somebody independent of the project who authorises releases into the environment. And it's not the project manager, nor is it the IT help desk or the IT dev team lead. Okay? It should be somebody independent because they don't have a vested interest in that release actually going ahead. And it's all about that. It's walking that tightrope between risk management and release management. Your job for release management is to protect the environments. We still see an awful lot of people who go into production environments and change something without never testing it somewhere else. And it's a real issue in the industry. And the amount of times I actually get asked for staff to come in and troubleshoot a SharePoint system, it's usually because somebody's been in tinkering with things. Not via central admin, they've gone in and run a bit of PowerShell, or they've simply released a component that they haven't tested anywhere else, and suddenly something's brought to its knees. Good release management is really critical because it allows you to do that. Deliver what you said you would, critically, to get sign-off. And sign-off is the one thing that protects you from litigation, stops you getting sued if you're providing services to a client, but also allows you, if you work for an organisation who are delivering SharePoint, to say, actually, I did what you asked me to do. This is exactly what you've asked me to do, and I've got the sign-off proof to do this. I want my pay rise at the end of the year because I've done my job 100%. Makes it very difficult for managers to actually argue with you that you haven't done the job right if you get sign-off for something that's been put in the environment. So it's equally important if you're in the delivery team to make sure you get sign-off for the work that you do, because it's proof to somebody like me that you've done your job. It's a horribly cumbersome process. Don't want to dwell on this too long. Involves change approval boards. Does everybody have change approval boards where they work? So a couple of hands. You must make sure that you keep the tooling that you've used for doing any kind of release management. If you're using tooling, some of the deployment mechanisms like AvePoint, for example. You should determine whether you're going to do manual deployments or automated ones, and everybody should know what that entails. You should communicate that out to people. And you should report back to the change approval board or whoever is responsible for actually approving the releases about whether it was successful or not. Because if it wasn't successful, you need to react to that. Quite often we see a lot of releases that fail. Nobody really knows about it. The IT team don't really tell anybody. It's a bit of a flaw. And again, if you've not got a process in your organisation, you need to flag this up because it's about protecting the environments. And inevitably that's about protecting your jobs and making sure you're doing a good job. Really common failure points. We don't tie the releases back to design agreements. Service packs. We don't amend the design documents to say we're putting a service pack in. There's no addendums on the back of the design document. So I turn up on site wondering why there's issues with the SharePoint platform, and all I've got is a design, and I've got nothing to say what was changed since that design was actually signed off. Remember, the design is done, long live the design. You'd be surprised how many projects forget to keep the source code for components that they've developed. What they do is they release the artifact into the environment, be it a web part or something like that, and they put the web part in the software library, but the source code was on the developer's laptop. And the developer's left the business and the laptop gets recycled, and they've got no way of reverse engineering that component. And it might be the most critical component in your SharePoint system that's been written. This happens far too many times on projects that I come across. You'd be amazed how many times off-the-shelf versions of software are not kept by the project team. And they've bought some magical metadata component that does some whizzy navigation. And they go to download it from the internet 3 years later because they're having a problem with their system and they're trying to rebuild something. And the company's gone out of business. Or the component doesn't exist anymore. Or they've changed the version and you can't get access to the source code for what that component did. And suddenly you're trying to re-engineer that out of your system at a critical time like financial year end where everybody's dependent on what that component did. But you can't fix it because it wasn't in your software library. You'd be amazed how many times this happens. Again, we need sign-offs for designs. We need sign-offs for testing. Sign-offs in the dev team for code walkthroughs to prove that the developers, their work that they've done has been checked by somebody else. It's been authorized and approved by the dev team lead. Again, it's all about communication. But understanding that the program itself understands the nature of changes, and we've communicated this out to everybody. So everybody understands there's a change gone on. I came across one business who had one guy doing change management. He was also the guy who was doing support. So he was the only guy who was putting changes in. And he was on leave. He put a change in the day before he went on leave for 2 weeks. And the system was entirely out of operation for 2 weeks. And it cost the business hundreds of thousands of pounds. Because he was the only person who actually knew what the change was, and nobody knew how to back it out. They had no quality records whatsoever to refer back to. And they ended up calling in MCS, Microsoft Consulting, to have to come on board and try and work out what the problem was in the middle of that 2-week period, because they couldn't get in touch with him in the middle of Egypt or wherever he was. This happens over and over and over. So, comms, absolutely critical in every phase of your project. Must tie back to your vision, remember. Must have plans, got to be comprehensive. Got to be building in a very prescribed and prescriptive way. You wouldn't build a house without a plan. So why would you put SharePoint in without a plan? And you have to control release management like your life depends upon it. And the most successful projects that we see have intensely tight release management tied to them. And then we have this thing we call testing, which is the most boring thing in boring land, incidentally. But what I want to see from testing on your project teams is signed off results and clearly defined metrics. What we see is the developer said it would work. Again, we see this over and over again. Now testing, we'll whiz through this because this is really very similar to release management as well. It's all about risk management. And it's about this. It's about avoiding confusion, ensuring that your client or your business sponsor actually understands that you've delivered and tested what you said you were going to do, so there's no comeback. Like release management, should run independent of the build team if you can, because it means they don't have a vested interest. It's got to be driven by metrics. Testing forms part of your change board. Your change board should understand when testing has failed. They should make decisions about whether or not to permit a release to actually go forward because it didn't test well or did test well, or you haven't fixed enough defects. Again, this is a highly skilled job. We have, at Capgemini, we actually have requirements at the minute for dedicated test people in SharePoint projects. We tend to leave it to the developers to do. We're starting to see more and more projects at the minute asking questions like, how do I test something in Office 365? We're doing a hybrid build. How am I going to test the deployment of components across that hybrid build? You're not allowed a performance test at all in O365. You have to build a separate environment that kind of looks like it, and you can kind of do some hope for the best testing. That's what we call it. How are you going to do this testing these days? It's getting really complicated. So it's becoming a very specialized skill. And not many companies are looking at it as a specialized skill or trying to identify organizations that can help them do SharePoint testing, especially in the hybrid world. Communication, again. If you're not testing on your project team, or you don't think you're doing enough testing, for God's sake, tell your project manager that you think you need to be doing more testing. So he can at least inform the business sponsor that you might not have added enough time in for testing. Horribly cumbersome process. Got to be planned, needs scheduling. No developers testing their own code. It's remarkable how many developers think their code works until we get it into a test bed somewhere, test environment, and it fails and falls over. You should also understand how many tests you need to do, but how long it takes those tests to actually occur. How much time is it going to consume on your project plan to do testing? How many tests a minute can you run? How long will it take to actually complete the test plan? What happens if you need to redo testing? What happens if you need to come around and do it again? You've got to put the work back into the Scrum team. That's going to consume more parts of that elephant that they've been tasked to build. It's going to get a smaller elephant because there's less time. And it's also really important that you do user acceptance testing. Get the business users involved in your testing. Operational acceptance testing. Understand the scope of the testing when you're talking to third parties. We often just rely on the third party providing a service, and we try and hold them to the SLA because we get something called service credits. Now that's good, but those service credits are unlikely to pay for the recovery of your organisation if you're so dependent on those external dependencies that your company goes down. They'll give you some service credits, but if you can't operate as a business, it doesn't really help you, does it? If it can be, make it encompassing. You should be testing usage patterns and business scenarios. You should be testing all of the things that are listed, search, indexing, all the solutions, all your integrations, and security hardening. I'm always staggered by the amount of people who put their SharePoint systems on the internet and don't do any penetration testing. And then they wonder why they've got hacked later and their systems aren't working and they can't work with their third-party partners. See this a lot in law firms who kind of scrimp a little bit on doing stuff, unfortunately. It doesn't need to be encompassing, but again, it's this litigation problem, you see. It actually helps with sign-off. And what we want to see, what I want to see all the time is sign-off. I want to see people taking responsibility for what they've actually delivered. Remember that racy chart you mentioned earlier, the responsibility chart? I want to see responsibility so I don't have to come into your project and start asking who was responsible for doing this. Why have we not got sign-off for this component having been released? So, like release management, fairly similar set of common failure points in test processes. We don't tie the test plans back to the original vision. People kind of test in isolation. They come up with this as an afterthought. We don't keep the source code for the automated testing. So when we come to do regression testing, we need to change the source code. We kind of have to rebuild everything. We see this happen over and over again. And again, we need to get sign-offs. Communication, about communication. About everybody understanding what testing has actually occurred and how well you're doing. It's the pat on the back for all of you guys who spend all of your time building SharePoint and doing hard work. You need to know you've done a good job. Testing is the thing that tells you you've done a good job. So, remember, comms, the critical thing. Got to have a vision. Everything ties back to it over and over again. We keep repeating this. Got to have a comprehensive plan. Many failing projects haven't got a plan. We need to understand the build. That build has to be prescriptive. We don't make it up as we go. We refer back to the plan, which refers back to the vision. Everything needs to be released in an efficient and effective way, and everything should be tested. And these are the things that we see fail on projects over and over again. And then we have this thing, this magic word that we see popping up on TechNet and in conversations around the coffee booth. What's this governance stuff? What I want to see is the importance of governance entirely understood across your organisation, specifically across the SharePoint program. What we tend to see is that the impotence of governance doesn't really work well. It's not very satisfying. Why do we need it? So everything that you could possibly have is dumped into SharePoint, and we still can't find anything. We don't have any information architecture because we didn't really realise that was important. We have some rather confusing navigation. People can't work their way around SharePoint. The organisation isn't really structured that way. Team sites are popping up like mushrooms. They're consuming storage all over the place because people are using it as a dumping ground for what used to be file servers. Sorry. And we have no idea how many there are or how many we actually need to delete or remove. It starts getting referred to as that SharePoint thing, or even less polite names. And people don't really want to use it anymore because it's turned into something that it was never destined to be. And we see this over and over again. And of course, the vision at this stage is starting to get a little bit cloudy. We can't really map back the business benefits that we're seeing in the organisation to what we originally tried to see and put together on the project. Common indicators as well. Really common ones. We see this over and over again. Sites create at will with no guidance, no approval process for somebody coming in and creating sites. The worst thing Microsoft ever gave was the ability for self-service site creation. And people exploit this willy-nilly and just create what they like. Every site looks different. Most companies are trying to create a cohesive brand. The introduction of design managers is going to create hell in your organizations if you don't govern it. There aren't any corporate policies, so we don't know what information we actually need to keep because there's nothing tied to retention policies. We didn't really tie these back to content types because we didn't perhaps understand what content types were, because we didn't realize we needed information architecture. We didn't realize we needed those skills to tell us what content types were and go out into the business and the organization to identify what the content type should look like. We give access to tools like SharePoint Designer so people can come in and break things without putting the appropriate controls behind the scenes to stop them doing this, or having a policy that actually outlines what you're allowed to do with tools like SharePoint Designer. We haven't really got any litigation or legal hold process in place, or if it's in place, it's a bit cumbersome. So we end up retaining documents in a hold state that we don't really need to keep. And we can never get rid of them because they're held. And they start accumulating data on data on data because things are being held by people. Because we didn't set up the content types the right way, the records managers can't really do their job effectively. So you're starting to lose business benefit because they don't really understand what the retention process should be and what you should be keeping. So SharePoint tends to be full of things like conversations on football, the latest menu from the coffee shop, and stuff that really isn't deemed important or necessary to hold on to, but it keeps popping up in search results and people are starting to get frustrated by seeing things that are not relevant to their day-to-day use. If you come across this, you're going to have to think about doing a migration plan to actually recover the service. It's very hard to reapply content types to buckets of information because it's very hard to actually understand what that information is and which kind of content type it needs applying. It's difficult to recursively apply things like taxonomy, navigation and structure because people have already got silos of information created but they're not in the right place. And it's quite hard still to split out things like site collections and make them more cohesive units. Very difficult to do that. So there's a massive cost attached to this. If you start going down the route of bad governance, you're into a migration project at some point, usually just to fix this problem. And I see this on programs that have terabytes and terabytes of data. I come across one company recently that had 300 terabytes of data in their SAN that was entirely unstructured. They didn't have any concept of content types. 300 terabytes of data. They're now facing a 5-year plan to try and turn that into something usable. 5 years of expense and a major project team having to come in to actually get that information into a usable state. And it's information they've accumulated over the past 10 years since they started out with SharePoint 2001. Remarkable. Governance, a long word and a horribly long process. Don't forget how important this is and make sure everybody on the project team understands that, including the business sponsors. It begins really early on. You don't leave governance till the end of your program. I'm working with one client at the minute, again, that are starting to write the governance plan now, even though they're behind on the actual go-live date of releasing SharePoint into the organisation. So they're just beginning to write the governance plan to tell people how they can use SharePoint, and it should have been launched 2 weeks ago. Now that's quite remarkable because they would have already had thousands of documents thrown into this thing had it been live. If you leave it too late, it's simply too late. You can guarantee this will cost you thousands and thousands of pounds to rectify. You're going to have specialist skills to do governance. You need to recognise this on your project team. People who really understand SharePoint to an in-depth degree, but also people who understand things like service management, capacity management, all the aspects of ITIL and service management frameworks actually form part of governance as well. It's not just SharePoint in isolation any longer. Again, it's massively underestimated in its complexity. Even the default starting governance plan that you'll find on Microsoft, which is anything but encompassing, is about 50 pages long. Most of the governance plans that I see that are entirely comprehensive are about 900 pages. It's a really scary amount of documentation that you have to put together that describes every aspect of how you should use that service. It includes things like what you do with sandbox solutions, what the principles are for writing new objects of code, how you do release management, and how that process is actually impacted by CAB, what the change request process might be, what capacity management is, what the fill factors might look like, and how the service teams have to respond to databases becoming full, perhaps even what the process is for clearing those things down or requesting new pieces of work. It's got to be encompassing, you must plan it, but most importantly, you've got to publish it. I do come across many projects who've got a governance plan. It's not very comprehensive, but nobody's read it. The only person who's seen it is the person who wrote it. But what they've done is they've ticked off the milestone to say we have a governance plan, but they're not following it. It's usually a failure point. It is probably the most critical aspect of success of a SharePoint project once it's in situ. If you don't govern it, you're guaranteed your project will eventually fail. It might not fail from the outset, but eventually the business benefits that you originally put the service in place for are going to flounder and you're going to come to issues. Just to show you how comprehensive it is and how much you've got to govern, here's a rather nasty looking list. For contents, you've got to cover metadata, content levels, permissions and templates. For security, you should be looking at authentication. What do you do about malware protection on your service? Certainly with SharePoint 2013, we haven't really got anything to do antiviruses anymore. There's no engines available. How are you going to do that? It needs to be in your governance plan. It's got to be described. What about retention? Again, information management policies, record centers, managed metadata services. A huge amount of things that you actually have to govern on a day-to-day basis. This one, how do you terminate team sites in your organization? Do you simply mark them read-only? Do you actually delete them? What do you do about all the information that was in them? What are you going to say about that? Somebody has to make decisions because people have to use the system, so people need guidance and instructions, and without it, they'll do what they like. It's not best done by admins either. It's not something we give to the SharePoint administrator to do. He should not define the governance plan. You tap into that person as a resource to help you draft the plan, to understand some of the technical complexities if you don't quite understand them. It's got to be business driven. It's got to tie back to that vision and the objectives of what you're trying to do. If it's strongly about collaboration, then your governance plan is going to be strongly driven by governance around content types, collaboration, information type retentions. So, I won't repeat everything we've said about where we're going. We do need comms. We do need vision. It's the same message as we work through these things that comes out over and over again, the same problems that we see. And eventually, just to conclude, we get systems into support. And what we want to see when we are in support is continuous service improvement processes applied. Many projects that we see who've got SharePoint in a supported state kind of just leave the IT support desk to get on with it. And they don't really pay it a great deal of attention. And then they lose the most critical IT administrator they've got, who's the most knowledgeable guy, and it's left in the hands of somebody who does a bit of site collection admin. And things start to fall foul on the service, and we end up seeing him going in and hacking about in central admin and bringing the service to his knees. I actually had a SharePoint administrator, we got called in to recover a platform in a major government department, a major government system, took them offline for 3 days. And this is a critical system, and we had a SharePoint administrator who got confused in central admin and started clicking all the buttons that said yes. And this actually happened. The system collapsed in a heap, and it took them 3 days to recover the system because they hadn't tested their backup process as well. And in fact, what they lost was 3 days worth of data because they didn't have log shipping in place for the backup mechanism that they were taking. They were taking 24-hour periods of backup, and they couldn't get it up and running again. So they actually lost 3 days worth of work, and it cost the department hundreds of thousands of pounds to actually recover this. One simple thing, clicking the wrong buttons in central admin. So what we want to see is continuous service improvement. What we want to see, it's in, we're done, great. Fantastic for consulting firms because we're finished, we can walk away, we can leave it in your hands. That's when the scary bit starts because you actually have to manage it. So we want to see continuous service improvement. It's a quality improvement process that you must actually get sponsor buy-in from when you start thinking about putting SharePoint in at the outset. And this is really important that we get sponsor buy-in because there's a cost attached to this. It might mean you need more people in your SharePoint administration team. You should be doing all of these things. Weekly ops meetings, business reviews, technical infrastructure reviews. Does your hardware still cope 6 months after you've gone live? Does it still cope a year after you've gone live? How does that fit in with the strategy for actually working up towards a virtualization strategy, for example? So, just because delivery is complete, that quality responsibility we've talked about right the way through the presentation doesn't actually end. Final slide. Microsoft are now strongly recommending that you have proactively trained skills for SharePoint, for both SharePoint 2013 and for SQL as well. We actually think you need to go much wider than that and make sure that you cover every facet of SharePoint as well, including things like federated identity management. And this support process that we see over and over again simply reiterates what we said all the way through this talk. You should model it, you should design it, pilot test it, optimize it, deploy it, monitor and maintain it, and repeat this cycle over and over and never stop doing it, because it's really important that you do this right. Invest in your staff is probably the final message that we have, or you can expect your SharePoint project to fail. SharePoint staff are very hard to find. The grass is greener on the other side, so make sure you keep them happy. We're done. Do we have any questions?